It was an ordinary morning, and Jamila was excited to head to school. She loved the way her curly hair framed her face, a symbol of pride for her. Her father always told her, "Your hair is beautiful, Jamila. It tells the world who you are." She smiled as she adjusted the bright blue ribbon that held back her thick curls, ready to face the day with confidence. As Jamila stepped off the bus and walked toward her school's entrance, she noticed something different. The school felt quieter than usual. She glanced around and saw a police officer standing near the door. She wasn't sure what was going on, but she shrugged it off, thinking it was probably nothing. The officer seemed to be looking at the students, especially the ones who were standing out. As Jamila walked past him, she felt his eyes on her, making her uncomfortable. She tried to ignore it, focusing on her friends who waved at her, but before she could join them, the officer called out to her. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Jamila turned, startled. She didn't know why he was talking to her. The officer's tone wasn't kind, and Jamila felt a knot form in her stomach. "Come here," he said, motioning her over. Confused, Jamila slowly walked toward him. What was going on? Had she done something wrong? The officer didn't give her a chance to speak. He looked at her hair, the thick, natural curls that she loved so much, and his face twisted into a frown. "What's this mess?" he muttered, almost as if to himself. "You need to get rid of all this." Jamila was shocked. She stared at him, not sure how to react. Was he really saying that her hair was a problem? Before she could respond, the officer reached into his bag and pulled out a pair of scissors. The world seemed to slow down. "What are you doing?" Jamila asked, her voice shaking, but the officer didn't answer. In a matter of seconds, he began cutting through her hair. Jamila's heart raced as the officer continued, snipping away at her curls. She felt helpless and confused. She wanted to run, but she couldn't. All she could do was watch in disbelief as her beautiful hair, which had always made her feel proud, was being cut away without her permission. Other students gathered around, some whispering, some staring in silence. Jamila wanted to scream, to stop him, but she didn't know what to do. Her emotions ran wild. Anger, embarrassment, and sadness all mixed together. Why was he doing this? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer stepped back, satisfied with his work. Jamila's hair, once full and proud, was now much shorter, uneven, and ragged. She stood there, feeling exposed and vulnerable. She tried to hold back tears, but they came anyway, rolling down her cheeks. Her friends rushed to her side, their faces full of sympathy and confusion. "Are you okay, Jamila?" one of them asked, but Jamila could barely answer. She was in shock. What had just happened? And why did the officer treat her this way? Jamila couldn't understand. But one thing was clear. This moment would stay with her forever. And little did she know, this incident would change her life in ways she never expected. The bell rang, signaling the start of school, but Jamila couldn't concentrate. Her mind kept replaying what had just happened, the officer cutting her hair, her friends' worried faces, and the feeling of humiliation that burned inside her. She couldn't stop thinking about how she felt when she looked in the mirror earlier that morning, proud of her natural curls, and now seeing them gone. Throughout the day, Jamila tried to focus on her lessons, but all she could think about was her hair and what the other students were saying. Some whispered behind her back, others just stared. The laughter she usually heard in the hallways now felt distant, like an echo she couldn't reach. At lunch, Jamila sat with her friends, but even their kindness couldn't make her feel better. They all asked if she was okay, offering words of comfort, but Jamila just nodded, not sure how to explain the pain she was feeling. Her hair was part of her identity. It had always been a symbol of pride for her, something her family had always celebrated. Now it felt like a part of her was taken away. "I can't believe he did that to you," her best friend, Aisha, said, shaking her head. "You didn't deserve that." Jamila forced a smile, but inside, she was hurting. It wasn't just about the hair. It was about how powerless she felt. How could an officer, someone who was supposed to protect people, do something so cruel? She didn't understand. When she got home that afternoon, Jamila went straight to her room. She locked the door behind her and stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her hair was uneven, and she looked so different. For the first time, she didn't recognize herself. She reached up to touch the shortened strands, feeling empty. It wasn't just hair. It was a part of who she was. It felt like the officer had tried to erase that part of her identity. Her mother knocked softly on the door. "Jamila, honey, can I come in?" Jamila didn't respond right away. She didn't want to talk, but she knew her mother was worried. When she opened the door, her mother's eyes widened. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, taking in Jamila's new look. I didn't want this, Mom," Jamila said, her voice shaking. "Why did he do it?" Her mother sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I don't know, baby. I don't know why he thought it was okay to do that. But I promise you, we will figure this out. You don't have to go through this alone." Jamila leaned into her mother, feeling a little comforted by her presence, but the pain still lingered. Her mother was right. She wasn't alone. But the anger and sadness inside her only grew stronger. She wanted to fight back, to make the officer understand how wrong his actions were. The next few days were harder. Jamila found it difficult to go to school. Every time she looked in the mirror, she remembered what happened. She wished she could turn back time, but she knew she couldn't. All she could do was find a way to get justice. Her father had always taught her to stand up for herself, and now was the time to do just that. Jamila made up her mind. She would not let the officer get away with what he had done. This wasn't just about her hair anymore. It was about respect, dignity, and the right to be who she was. Jamila couldn't get the thought of what happened out of her mind. She had cried, talked with her friends, and tried to move on, but the feeling of injustice lingered. Her family was determined to get to the bottom of the situation. Jamila's father, a strong and respected man in their community, had always taught her to stand up for what was right. And now, it was time to do just that. The first step was speaking to the school. Jamila's mother called the principal to explain what had happened. She was upset, but her voice remained calm and clear. "This is not just about hair," she said firmly. "It's about my daughter's dignity. No one should have the right to make someone feel small, especially not an officer." The principal listened carefully, promising that the school would look into it. But Jamila wasn't sure if she trusted them. The officer was part of the city's security team, and sometimes people like that had a lot of power. Jamila knew the system could be unfair, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. Her father had always said, "You must fight for what's right, even when it's hard." That evening, her father came home from work and sat down with Jamila. He could see the sadness in her eyes, and he knew that something had to be done. "We'll take action, Jamila," he said. "This officer will not get away with this. We're going to find a way to make things right." Jamila's heart lifted slightly at her father's words. He was a man of his word, and if anyone could make sure the officer faced consequences, it was him. But she also knew that this wasn't going to be easy. The officer had power, and the system didn't always work in favor of the people who were wronged. Her father didn't want to go into details, but Jamila could see the serious expression on his face. He was making plans, preparing to take legal action. She didn't fully understand what was going to happen next, but she knew one thing for sure: her family was going to fight for her. The next day, Jamila went to school with a different feeling. She wasn't going to let the officer's actions control her life. She was determined to keep her head high, even if it felt difficult. The whispers and stares from other students were still there, but Jamila tried to ignore them. She knew that the truth was on her side. In the days that followed, Jamila's family met with lawyers who would help them understand what they could do next. The more they learned, the more Jamila realized how important it was to stand up for herself, not just for her hair, but for her right to be treated with respect. Her father promised that they would do everything they could to make sure the officer was held responsible for his actions. As the process started, Jamila felt a sense of relief. She was no longer fighting alone. She had the support of her family, her friends, and even her community, who were all standing behind her. It wasn't going to be easy, but Jamila knew that justice was worth fighting for. The officer had always believed that he was in control. He worked every day with the idea that he had the power to make decisions, to enforce rules, and to keep people in line. It wasn't just his job. It was a role that gave him a sense of authority and respect. He didn't think much about the people he interacted with. He didn't need to. It was just part of his routine. But after the incident with Jamila, things started to feel different. The officer had only seen her for a moment, but he didn't realize who she was, or who her family was. He had acted quickly, thinking it was just another small act of discipline. It wasn't anything personal. He didn't consider how his actions could hurt her or what they might mean to someone else. He had been in control of the situation. At least he thought he was. He made a decision on a whim, a choice that he thought would be harmless. It was just hair after all. But Jamila's reaction stayed with him. The hurt in her eyes, the way she looked as if the world had collapsed on her in that moment. He hadn't expected her to react that way, and it made him feel uneasy. Days passed, and the officer went about his duties, but he couldn't shake the image of Jamila from his mind. Something about her quiet strength, the way she held herself despite what had happened, kept bothering him. At first, he brushed it off. He was an officer. He didn't need to care about one person's feelings. But the more he thought about it, the more guilt crept in. Then he heard about the meeting at the school. The principal had told him that Jamila's family was planning to take action. The officer's stomach dropped. He had no idea that Jamila's family had such a strong influence, or that they were determined to fight for what had been taken from her. Suddenly, the situation seemed much more serious than he had ever imagined. The officer's pride began to falter. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone who seemed so powerless at the time. Jamila was just a young girl, right? But now he saw that there was much more to her than he had realized. He couldn't help but feel a growing sense of regret. What had he done? As the days went by, the officer began to understand the importance of his actions. His role as an officer had always been about upholding justice, but in this case, it was clear that he had made a mistake. The truth was, he had crossed a line, and now it wasn't just about the hair. It was about the respect he had taken from a young girl, and the anger that was rising in her family. The officer had not expected things to go this far, but as he heard more about Jamila's father and the support her family was gathering, he realized that this was a situation he couldn't easily escape from. He had made a decision, but now, the consequences were starting to weigh on him. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change in ways he never expected. Jamila had no idea that her life was about to take a big turn. It had only been a few days since the incident with the officer, but every day felt longer. The pain of what had happened still lingered in her heart, and although her family was doing everything they could, Jamila couldn't help but feel a bit helpless. She had always believed that people would do what was right, but now she was starting to see how things weren't always fair. Her father, however, had a plan. He'd been working quietly behind the scenes, preparing to take the next step. One afternoon, while Jamila was sitting in the living room, her father came in with a serious look on his face. He called her over to him. "Jamila, I need to talk to you about something," he said, his voice calm but firm. Jamila looked up at him, her heart racing. "What is it, Dad?" she asked, wondering if there was any new information about the officer. Her father sat down beside her and looked her in the eye. "You remember the officer who cut your hair, right?" he asked. "Of course I do," Jamila said, her voice a little shaky. Her father nodded slowly. "I've been doing some research. That officer, he didn't know who you were. But now, he's about to find out." Jamila's confusion grew. "What do you mean?" Her father smiled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. "It turns out your grandfather was a well-known leader in this community, and your uncle, well, let's just say he has connections in places that can make things happen." Jamila's eyes widened. She had heard stories about her family's history, but she never realized how much influence they truly had. Her father was part of a long line of people who had made a difference, and now she was starting to understand the weight of her own heritage. "So, you're saying?" Jamila's voice trailed off as she began to piece things together. "That officer didn't realize who he was messing with," her father said, his tone now filled with determination. "Your family's reputation, the respect people have for us. It's time to make sure the right thing is done." Jamila's heart skipped a beat. Her father's words brought a sense of strength and power she hadn't felt before. She realized that while she had been feeling weak and vulnerable, her family had the support and resources to make things right. The officer, who had acted without thinking, was about to face the consequences of his actions in a way he hadn't expected. Jamila felt a mix of emotions. She was relieved to know that her family was behind her, but she also felt a sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up for what was right and making sure no one else had to face the same kind of treatment she had. "I'm ready, Dad," Jamila said quietly, her voice filled with newfound strength. "Let's do this." Her father gave her a reassuring smile and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Jamila. You're not alone in this. We'll make sure you get the justice you deserve." And so, with her family's support, Jamila felt a sense of purpose. She was no longer just a girl who had her hair cut without her permission. She was part of a legacy of strength, and she was ready to take the next step. Jamila couldn't believe how quickly things were changing. Just a few days ago, she had felt lost, unsure of what to do or where to turn. But now, with her family's support and the knowledge of their influence, she felt a surge of confidence she hadn't felt before. Her father's plan was coming together, and she could feel that justice was within reach. The officer, on the other hand, had no idea what was coming. As the days passed, he went about his usual duties, but something inside him started to change. He had been hearing rumors about Jamila's family, how respected they were, how powerful they could be when they chose to stand up for something. The officer had never thought much about Jamila or her family before. He had seen her as just another student, just another person he could control. But now, as the pressure mounted, he began to realize just how wrong he had been. One afternoon, as the officer was walking into the precinct, he was stopped by a colleague. "Hey, have you heard about that girl?" the colleague asked. "You know, the one cut her hair. Word's getting around that her family is making some serious moves." The officer froze, his heart skipping a beat. He had been trying to push the memory of what he had done to Jamila out of his mind, but now it was back in full force. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I heard her dad's got connections," the colleague said. "I'm telling you, things are starting to change. They're not letting this go." The officer felt his stomach tighten. The reality of the situation was sinking in. He had thought his actions were small, just a momentary decision. But now it seemed like it was spiraling out of control. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was in deep trouble. Meanwhile, Jamila's father had already begun taking action. With his connections, he was able to gather information about the officer and the situation. He worked with lawyers who knew how to navigate the system, and together, they began making sure the officer knew that Jamila's family wasn't going to back down. The pressure on the officer started to grow, and he couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. At home, Jamila could feel the shift happening. Her father was meeting with people, making calls, and organizing everything that needed to be done. While she didn't know all the details, she trusted her father and believed that the truth would come out. The more she learned about her family's past and their role in the community, the more she understood that they weren't just going to let this go. They would fight for her. For the officer, the realization that he was facing consequences began to weigh on him. He had acted in a moment of thoughtlessness, but now he had to deal with the results. His pride had blinded him, and now it was starting to cost him. The once confident officer began to feel the pressure as the days went by. knowing that the justice Jamila sought was getting closer. The days that followed were filled with tension. Jamila could feel the weight of what was happening around her, but she was no longer the scared girl who had once been humiliated by the officer's actions. Her confidence had been restored, not just by her family's support, but by the strength she had discovered within herself. Her father had taken charge of the situation, making sure everything was in place. Lawyers were involved, and they were gathering the evidence needed to hold the officer accountable. Jamila's family had deep roots in the community, and their influence was making a difference. The officer, who had once thought he was untouchable, was now on the receiving end of the pressure. One evening, Jamila sat down with her father after dinner. He looked at her with pride in his eyes. "We've done everything we can, Jamila," he said. "Now, it's time for the truth to come out. And when it does, that officer will have to answer for what he did." Jamila nodded, feeling a mix of emotions. She was nervous, but she also felt ready. She had learned so much in the past few days about her family's power, the importance of standing up for what was right, and the strength she had within her. The officer's actions had hurt her, but now she was no longer focused on revenge. She wanted justice, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel small or disrespected. The next morning, Jamila's father called her into his office. There, he handed her a letter. "This is the official complaint we're filing against the officer," he said. "It's time." Jamila took a deep breath and read through the letter. It was clear and direct, outlining exactly what had happened to her and the emotional toll it had taken. As she read the words, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. This was no longer just a personal battle. It was about making sure that no one else had to go through what she had experienced. At the same time, the officer was feeling the heat. He had tried to ignore the mounting pressure, but it was impossible to escape. Word had spread through the precinct, and his colleagues began to look at him differently. He had made a mistake, a big one. And now, it was clear that his actions would have consequences. He had thought that he could brush it off, but now, the situation was much bigger than he had ever imagined. Jamila's family was relentless. They weren't just going after the officer, they were going after the system that allowed this kind of behavior to happen in the first place. Jamila's father worked with his lawyers to ensure that the officer understood the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just about the hair anymore. It was about accountability, respect, and the right to be treated with dignity. For the officer, the realization of his mistake began to hit harder each day. He had hurt a young girl, taken away her sense of self, and disrespected her in front of everyone. And now he had to face the consequences. Jamila wasn't interested in making the officer suffer. She just wanted him to understand the impact of his actions. And as the process continued, she found herself more focused on the idea of redemption, both for herself and for the officer who had wronged her. She had the chance to make a difference, and she was going to take it. As the days passed, the weight of the situation began to lift from Jamila's shoulders. The legal process was still underway, but with each passing moment, she felt more and more supported by her family. They were there for her, standing strong together, and that made all the difference. It was no longer just about what had happened to her. It was about the strength they had as a family and the love they shared. Jamila's father spent many hours in meetings, making sure that every detail was being handled. He wasn't just fighting for her, but for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly. Her mother, too, had been a rock through it all, always offering comfort and encouragement. Jamila began to see her parents not just as her protectors, but as people who truly cared about doing what was right. They weren't just working for justice for her, they were standing up for the entire community. One afternoon, after a long day, Jamila's father came into her room. He had a serious look on his face, but when he saw her sitting on the bed, he smiled. "Jamila," he began, "I know this has been hard, but I want you to understand something. What you've done here is more than just fighting for yourself. You've shown everyone what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it feels difficult." Jamila looked up at her father, a little surprised. "I didn't think of it that way. I just wanted things to be fair." Her father sat down beside her. "And that's exactly why you've made a difference. You didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for everyone who feels unheard or unnoticed. You've reminded us all that we have the power to change things, no matter how big or small." Jamila's heart swelled with pride. She had always known that her family was strong, but now she saw just how powerful their unity was. Together, they could face anything. She wasn't just a daughter anymore. She was part of something much bigger, something that would leave a lasting impact on their community. The days continued to pass, and as time went on, Jamila began to heal. She still thought about the officer and what had happened, but she no longer let it define her. Her hair would grow back, and she would always carry the strength she had gained through this experience. What mattered now was how she had faced the challenge, and how she had grown stronger because of it. One evening, her mother sat down with her and brushed her hair, something they hadn't done in a while. Jamila closed her eyes, feeling comforted by the familiar touch. It wasn't just about her hair anymore. It was about the love, the support, and the bond she shared with her family. Together, they had overcome something that could have broken them, but instead, it had made them stronger. Jamila was no longer the scared girl she had once been. She was a young woman who had learned to stand tall, to face the world with confidence, and to know that no matter what happened, she had the love and support of her family behind her. The future looked brighter now, not because the officer had been held accountable, but because Jamila had found her own strength, and with it, a sense of peace. As the weeks passed, Jamila's life slowly returned to normal, but the events that had unfolded would stay with her forever. The officer who had cut her hair was no longer part of the school or the community. He had been held accountable for his actions, and though Jamila didn't know all the details, she knew that justice had been served. It wasn't just about the officer being punished. It was about standing up for what was right and making sure that no one else would face the same kind of treatment. Jamila had learned so much through this experience. She had learned about the power of standing up for herself and for others, even when it seemed difficult. She had learned about the importance of family and the strength that came from knowing that you were never alone in a fight for justice. And most of all, Jamila had learned that she had a voice, and it mattered. The whole experience had changed her, but in a way that made her stronger. She no longer looked at her reflection in the mirror with sadness. Instead, she saw someone who had faced adversity head-on and come out stronger on the other side. Her hair was growing back, and though it wasn't the same as before, she had learned to embrace it in a new way. It was a reminder of her journey, of the strength she had discovered, and the battles she had fought and won. One afternoon, as Jamila sat with her mother, she looked out the window, thinking about everything that had happened. "I never thought it would be like this," she said quietly. "I never thought something so small would turn into something so big." Her mother smiled, her eyes full of pride. "You've made a difference, Jamila. You stood up when others might have stayed quiet. And because of that, things have changed." Jamila nodded, feeling a sense of peace that had been missing for so long. She was no longer just a victim of a cruel act. She had become a symbol of strength, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless. Jamila had proven that one person could make a difference, and that even in the face of injustice, the truth would always have a way of coming out. In the days that followed, Jamila became more involved in her community, helping to organize events and working to bring people together. She knew that the fight for fairness wasn't over, but she was ready to be part of something bigger. She had seen the impact of standing up for what was right, and now she wanted to help others do the same. Her father often told her, "The world will try to tell you who you are, but only you have the power to define yourself." Jamila now understood what he meant. She had taken control of her own story, and she would continue to write it with courage, strength, and love. The officer's actions had left a mark, but they had also sparked something much bigger, a movement for justice, respect, and the right to be treated with dignity. And that movement, Jamila knew, would continue to grow, with her at the heart of it, proud of who she was and where she came from.